30 years ago, English and Scottish settlers had crossed over the Irish Sea to the Irish province of Ulster. The settlers came under orders of the king, and nearly all were Protestants. Although Ireland was under English rule, the taking of Irish land caused many people to resent the new English settlers. In addition, most people of Ireland were Catholic, which made them dislike the Protestant settlers even more. 30 years later, the Irish now professed loyalty to King Charles I of England, but many still wanted to recover lands lost to the newcomers. They thought themselves humiliated by those who scorned the Catholic religion and the old Gaelic way of life.
Right, Donovan, how are you? Not good. Life hasn't been the same since those Protestant bastards stole me land. Can't farm enough taters anymore.
Aye, same. I used to be eating 40 taters a day. Lately I've only been eating a wee 35.
Tough luck, Patrick. Something's got to do something about this.
Aye, something's got to change.
And change it would. On the 22nd of October, an Irishman named Sir Phelim O'Neill went to visit his Protestant friend Lord Caulfield, like he often did. Only this time, he brought a group of soldiers with him.
Ah, Phelim, please come in.
What is the meaning of this? Why are all these bloody people here?
You know why, Caulfield. The Rebellion. We were kicked off our land 30 years ago, and we want it back.
So, you are taking Charlemont?
Indeed we are, and we are taking you too. Get 'em, lads!
Soon after taking Charlemont, Sir Phelim O'Neill assumed authority over Ulster and issued the proclamation of Dungannon.
This proclamation is to inform all in this country that the present meeting and assembly of the Irish is in no way intended against the king to hurt any of his subjects, either the English or the Scottish nation, but only for the defence and liberty of ourselves and of the natives of the Irish nation. We order all people at once to return to their homes under pain of death, and promise that any hurt done to any person or persons shall be at once repaired.
He falsely claimed that he had a document signed by the king authorizing this action, which encouraged many Catholics to believe they could lawfully join the rising with the king's blessing, while Protestants were left demoralized. After the proclamation of Dungannon, things did not settle peacefully everywhere. In some areas, chaos broke out as Protestant towns were plundered and burnt to the ground by Irish rebels. In Belturbet, a group of rebels seized the local colonists and led them over to a bridge. Most were thrown in to drown in the River Erne, while others were clubbed to death. In the winter of 1641, the rebels travelled around to different villages and banished the Protestant settlers. The Irish would strip the settlers of their belongings, as well as their clothes. Then they would threaten the settlers with death if they did not leave the area within a week. Since it was winter, many of the naked and homeless Protestants would die from exposure to the cold. The bloodiest massacre of the rebellion was the Portadown massacre. A rebel named Tool McCann led rebels to take the castle, pillage the town, burn half the houses, and drown 196 English Protestants in a nearby river. Rumours of massacres and other atrocities led to acts of vengeance by the Protestants. On January 1642, the McGee family, along with many others, were murdered in Antrim. Legend also has it that they were killed by being driven off the Gobbins Cliffs. In 1642, leading Catholics from all 4 provinces of Ireland met in Kilkenny to set up a provisional government, called the Confederation of Kilkenny. There they drew up the first written constitution of Ireland. It supported the royalist cause and adopted the motto, "For God, for the King, for the land of Ireland united." This new nation would stand for 7 years before one Englishman decided enough was enough. Oliver Cromwell.
Let's go, lads, north to Drogheda.
The moment he set foot in Ireland, he marched his army north to the town of Drogheda. He hoped that opposition elsewhere in Ireland would collapse in the face of a decisive victory. On the evening of Tuesday, the 10th of September, soldiers of Cromwell's new model army stormed the walls of Drogheda. They were ordered to show no mercy to any Irish who resisted. After heavy fighting, the new model army breached the walls. The fighting then moved to the Mill Market, where 2,000 Irish men were put to the sword. He also burned the steeple of St. Peter's Church. It was the decisive victory he hoped for, but the Irish didn't go down that easily. His army continued to move through Ireland, conquering Irish towns and killing those who didn't surrender. Eventually, the Irish Confederation disintegrated and a policy of banishment was initiated to crush any further resistance. All transportable Irish people were forced to move west of the River Shannon, and the soldiers of the new model army claimed the conquered land as their own. Thus ended the Irish Rebellion of 1641.
Hello everybody and welcome to the 7th video in our series of videos on the plantations in Ireland. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what Charles I's changes in policies were that caused such controversy in Ireland. Second, you guys should know what caused the 1641 rebellion and some facts about that rebellion. And finally, you guys should know what happened in England that led to Oliver Cromwell eventually coming to Ireland. As we saw in the last video, the English had learned their lessons from previous plantations and carried out a successful plantation in Ulster. The king who ordered that plantation, James I, died in 1625 and he was replaced by his son, King Charles I. Now, Charles admired the power of the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, and he wanted to rule without having to ask Parliament for permission to do things. To do this, he needed to extend his personal control, and he needed to extend it over both the government and the church. In 1632, he appointed a very close friend and ally, Sir Thomas Wentworth, as the Lord Deputy in Ireland to ensure that Charles had supreme power over the government and church in Ireland. Remember, the Lord Deputy is the King's representative in the country. As the King's representative, Wentworth alienated himself from all the traditional groups in Ireland, extorting money from the Old English with the Pale, and pushing Protestantism and planning the plantation in Connacht. However, this plantation never actually came to pass, as Charles was getting in trouble back in England. So what was the trouble that Charles was getting into? Well, he refused to use Parliament, who then in turn refused to vote him the money he needed to rule. So he imposed a lot of unusual taxes to get his money, like a tax on ship money, the tax trade on the sea. This affected the Ulster guilds we looked at who planted dairy in the last video. They resisted paying these taxes, and in 1639 Charles officially confiscated their lands. However, Probably the biggest mistake that Charles made was trying to establish greater control of the church for himself. He alienated the Catholic Old English and the Gaelic Irish by persecuting them, but he also managed to alienate a lot of the new planters in Ulster. Now, until now, the Church of Ireland had tolerated a wide range of Protestant beliefs and practices. So Presbyterians, who had large numbers among the Scottish planters in Ulster, were happy to join Church of Ireland churches as they could continue to practice their religion as they believed they should. However, Lord Deputy Wentworth enforced Charles's vision of a uniform church by introducing a new common book of prayer. This policy met massive resistance in both Scotland and Ulster, and the Scottish agreed to take a covenant, which is a religious vow to resist these changes. In 1639, Wentworth marched to Ulster to force the Ulster Scots, who had signed up to this covenant, to take the Black Oath, denouncing their covenant. But these Covenanters, as they were known, had powerful friends in Parliament, which was in opposition to King Charles I. They used their power to impeach Wentworth. They found him guilty of treason, and in 1641 they executed him. And this further deepened the divide between Charles I and the Parliament. The Gaelic Irish were closely monitoring all these developments, and when Charles suffered a military humiliation in Scotland in 1640 trying to enforce his common book of prayer, the Gaelic Irish believed it was time to rise in rebellion to try to take back their land. The rebellion under the leadership of Sir Phelim O'Neill started on the 22nd of October in 1641 in Ulster. The Irish victories were so quick and decisive in the first few days that they really didn't know what to do with all of those who had surrendered. Thousands of planters were driven off the land, and thousands more were massacred by the Gaelic Irish. Stories of the massacres were exaggerated in England and were met with absolute horror. The 1640s turned out to be one of the most confusing periods in Irish history, as while this rebellion was happening, civil war broke out in England between Charles I and his defenders, called the Cavaliers, against Parliament's Roundheads, as they were called, with Oliver Cromwell emerging as one of their greatest leaders. This led to the shifting of allegiances between all four groups in Ireland: the Gaelic Irish, the Anglo-Norman Irish, the Old English, and now the New English, who had been planted recently. And there were years of massacres and battles and sieges. English government in Ireland pretty much crumbled, and in October 1642, the Gaelic Irish and the Old English, who had always been traditionally enemies, united to form the Confederation of Kilkenny to rule the country. Massive battles at Dungan's Hill in Meath and Knocknanoose Hill in County Cork led to 3,000 and 4,000 men being killed respectively in those battles. By 1648, Charles I's cause was lost, as he was unable to get the better of Sir Thomas Fairfax, Oliver Cromwell, and their new model army. He was recaptured and executed by Parliament on the 30th of January 1649. England set up a new government ruled by the winners of the Civil War, and this new government was known as the Commonwealth. One of the first things the new Commonwealth government did was turn its attention to crushing the Irish who had opposed them. Oliver Cromwell, the leading general of the Civil War, was named Lord Lieutenant or Lord Deputy in 1649, and he was given £100,000 and 12,000 battle-hardened soldiers from the new model army that had just won the English Civil War. Cromwell made it clear from the beginning that he wasn't just coming to put down the rebellion, but he was coming for revenge for the massacre of the Protestants in 1641 when the rebellion began. And in the next video, we will see Cromwell's brutal invasion of Ireland. That brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know what Charles's changes in policy were that caused such controversy in Ireland. You guys should know what caused the 1641 rebellion and some facts about it. And finally, you guys should know what happened in England that led to Oliver Cromwell eventually coming to Ireland. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video. Hello everybody, and welcome to the 8th and final video in our series of videos on the plantations. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so you guys should know how Cromwell ended the war in Ireland. You guys should also know the condition of Ireland after the war and the conditions of the plantation that Cromwell introduced. And finally, you guys should know the consequences of these plantations. We saw in the last video how the Parliament Roundheads defeated King Charles I's Cavaliers in the English Civil War, thanks in large part to Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell's new model army. However, the war hadn't ended in Ireland, with many in the country still fighting for the dead king's cause. Cromwell came to Ireland in 1649 to finish the war. He landed in Ringsend in Dublin in August 1649, unopposed after the rebels had failed to capture Dublin. His first objective was to take the walled city of Drogheda, which blocked the way to Ulster where the massacres had happened. It was defended by about 3,000 soldiers, and Cromwell attacked it with 8,000 of his well-drilled soldiers and heavy artillery. He breached the walls and eventually defeated the rebels. Once the rebels were defeated, Cromwell ordered that all the survivors of the rebel army who were caught inside the walls of the town were to be slaughtered due to their refusal to surrender. This was meant to be a warning to the other towns, and rebel soldiers at walled garrisons in places like Trim and Dundalk fled upon hearing about this massacre. His next target was Wexford in the southeast of the country, which was an important port from which Irish pirates had been attacking English trade ships. The garrison of soldiers at Wexford prepared to fight, refusing to surrender. However, a rebel officer, scared that another massacre might occur, allowed Cromwell and his army in. Once they got in, Cromwell showed even more brutality than he had in Drogheda. He killed all the rebel soldiers and then he massacred the townspeople of Wexford. Upon hearing this, the towns of New Ross, Youghal in County Cork, Cork City in County Cork, and Kinsale in Cork all surrendered. Kilkenny, the seat of the Confederation of Kilkenny, which was founded in 1642, was also betrayed by a frightened trader who allowed Cromwell in, and Cromwell took the city at the end of March 1650. The last town taken by Cromwell was Clonmel in County Tipperary, where they put up a gallant fight. They actually ended up killing 2,000 of Cromwell's troops, but they were eventually defeated, and the leaders of the defence retreated to Limerick in 1650. 2 weeks later, Cromwell left Ireland, leaving his forces to his son-in-law Henry Ireton. Cromwell had been in Ireland for roughly 9 months, and he had caused massive suffering and death to the country. Ireton and his successor, General Ludlow, cleaned up the rest of the rebel cities. Limerick fell in 1652, and Galway was the last of the towns to fall to the English in May of 1652. 30,000 rebel soldiers were allowed to leave to enlist in countries not at war with England, and the war itself in Ireland was over by 1653. After the campaign, the towns and economy of Ireland were in ruins. Thousands of men and women and children were sold into indentured servitude or a form of slavery to work on the plantations in the Caribbean. This assault on Ireland was very expensive. Cromwell not only had to pay his soldiers, but also he had to pay back the men who had provided loans for the Civil War and the campaign in Ireland. Cromwell believed that a plantation was the best way to raise the money for this, and he also wanted to crush the Catholic religion and punish the rebel leaders. Under the Act of Settlement of 1652, England confiscated 3/4 of the land of Ireland. They confiscated the land of those who had fought against Parliament, and if you couldn't prove your loyalty, then you lost your land also. The dispossessed Irish were transplanted to Connacht in County Clare, The order was to remove themselves, their servants, and their goods to Hell or to Connacht by May 1st in 1651. The land was west of the River Shannon, which we can see here, and there was a mile-wide strip along the River Shannon and the coast of Connacht that only soldiers could settle on. Now, Catholic landlords were removed from this territory, but farmers and labourers were left on the 3 quarters that the English had confiscated to work the land. It was at this time that the most detailed map of any country in Europe was drawn up for Ireland by a man called William Petty. He accurately mapped roughly 11 million acres of confiscated land in 22 counties, which was divided between adventurers who had helped pay for the war and soldiers who had fought in it. And this survey is known as the Down Survey, we believe, because the survey was written down. Very original, I know. Now, this was the largest plantation undertaken by the British, and while it failed to wipe out the Catholic religion and make Ireland a loyal part of England, it did have massive and far-reaching effects. There was a massive change in the social structure of the country. In 1641, even after the plantations of Munster, the very successful plantation of Ulster, and the less successful plantations of Laois and Offaly, not to mention the native plantations that had taken place, Catholics still owned 3/5 of the land. However, by 1651, this had been reduced to merely a sixth, and this area was mainly in Connacht. Another consequence was that religious conflict would continue to be a feature of Irish history for over 300 years after these events. As for Oliver Cromwell, he ruled England not as king but as something called Lord Protector until his death in 1658. Upon his death, Parliament decided to return the royalists to power, and the son of the executed Charles I, Charles II, was restored to power in 1660, and he reigned until 1685. However, controversy reigned again when Charles II's successor, James II, was a Catholic. England and Ireland erupted into war again, with James being removed as king in 1688 and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. James came to Ireland for support to try and win back his throne. He and his supporters laid siege to the city of Derry for 105 days. However, they were unable to take the city, thanks to the help of 13 apprentice boys who closed the gates of the walled town in time. In 1689, William's army in Ireland defeated James II's army at the Battle of the Boyne on the 12th of July, ending yet another Irish insurrection. This saw a reintroduction and also an escalation of anti-Catholic and also Presbyterian laws known as the Penal Laws. Now, the plantations is one of the most important events in shaping the country of Ireland, and it has been struggling with its consequences ever since. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So you guys should now know how Oliver Cromwell ended the war in Ireland. You guys should know the condition of Ireland after the war and the conditions, the plantation that Cromwell introduced. And finally, you guys should know some of the consequences of the Cromwellian plantation. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.
London. Carnival A. Nahol mór an airde inis I daine an seo an cúlra seachtaach a bhaineann leis. Animnéas fearr an Iarracht an Parliament a réabhúla púdar, agus a dúling céasú miltinach I dúr London Riverwasa. Is írsma an ihe seo ón 7 hís déag. Ís chuntarteach, lán de chibhlintí fuilteach a creidimh. Is comarú é ar bhua an frotastúnachas an chatlachas I monaíocht hasna. Sa chláir seo, arcimidir scéal Bert úsal Eranach a bhí gafas a túr le linn na mblianta ba bhasad an cogaíocht creidimh. Bert a céasú go cruaí is a currach an báis go míthrócrach in Tyburn. walla a clia, sé jig dahead sa hain. Tá socrithe jaranacha iri amach in jeden an realtish an Janu.
Níl éon chuirsí simplí ar airimach sé da hain scéal anna chasta tá ar fád agus an chúisgur go hálíonn airimach sé da hain tá de starí fós a Aragón faoi sa látá Newán a tá sé cinnte go bhfuil ceangal díreach idir plándal trocha blion ribhe sin agus sé da hain. De chail fórmhór de Catholicí chuige a chuid tailte ag an am sin.
Ba ghéal é óg mag mahana, ar ó cuidhór calte ag I héin agus ag a winter.
Hugh McMahon, he's part of a family that is materially on the decline and really shows the extent of English and British colonisation in Ulster in the 17th century.
Ach, when Crochar Maguire la clan Gaelach éiri leo cuid de hailte a cheneil le linn na plandala. Rugu Crochar Maguire if our mama, Illu in Oxford Fogo talche farsinga a ahar egi, agus bhí sé mar onadé an chundé I Parliament walla a clia.
Colin Maguire, second Baron Enniskillen, was a peer and sat in the Irish House of Lords, and his family had materially benefited from the plantation of Ulster. They were one of the so-called deserving Irish families who would have gained fairly substantial tracts of land in Fermanagh.
Ach far éiri go mai leis le linn na plandala, cén fá an éiri chama a gunne an realtish.
The estates that they received in the early decades of the 17th century were a fraction of what they would have held before the plantations. So even though they became one of the largest landowners in County Fermanagh, they felt aggrieved that their estates had been much diminished.
Nadine few a fórrad eigen I Blandán na holla, níru siad sástans na dahadaí, agus tá siad sin lornach a go ceallaigh, agus an tairéimach a chóirla, mar níru siad in an, hí buntáistí níos fearr ag na nua gael, agus hí siad sin in an chóras an éireann, an chóras ach na míoch, an chóras politiúil, a lábhseáil a bhad níos fearr ná na gael.
Agus fá táhachtach eile, cuasaí creidimh. Bhí bunús na héireann fí bhíháin taiste, tuisc na raibh siad sásta a sean chreidiú a thabhairt suas agus ghlacu le crediú an stáit.
The one thing they were utterly determined to maintain was their Catholicism. They were extremely devout Catholics, and I think this was another factor that was clearly influencing Maguire when he decided that he was going to rise up in rebellion.
Tá sé tábhacht a go rá seo nach raibh tír námh splách a lorg ag na daoine a go raibh páirteach sa cóhéalaigh seo ag sé ag dahad a hain. Bhí sé de géirí chunra a sochrú leis an rí le cearta na Catholicí a chur a bhaim a ríis. So bhí siad sásta go bheith rí Charles mar rí rí na héireann ach ag an am céine go mbeadh carta bunúsach politiúil agus ó haibh an religún de ag Catholicí na héireann.
Bhí an tíréimach le tarlú ar an tríthe lás fiche de bhí dhearú fór. Bhí Phelim agus a chóghlacithe le seileamh a ghlacu ar na príomh-ionad mhíleata I dúsgurt na tíre. Agus bhí Maguire agus MacMahona agus 8 fearr le seileamh a ghlacu ar chaisleán Mhailithe Clia. Príomh siomh na cuacht de chomhlíní in Éireann agus éit ar ó stóras mór aram. Bhí siad ag éirí úsáid uhaint as an ganasacht seachas an lámh léidir, agus an sin agad éileamh a ógurt in aim an ré. Corú an plán na Gríoch gan mór an stró sa tuisgurt, ach ní hairlaí a tharla a Mhailithe Clia.
There's this figure in amongst the whole episode by the name of Owen O'Connolly. He was Hugh McMahon's foster brother. He also was a Protestant convert and a servant to Sir John Clotworthy, who was a planter in County Antrim.
Owen O'Connell, bhí sé sin páirteach sa chomhdhéalaigh an ihe ribh bhí rudí le titim amach chuí sé sin díreach go dtí an rialtas is Christian Blachia agus chuir sé an fistóibh cad bhí ag tarlú nó cad bhí le tarlú an láníigh sin. For an rialtas saidiúirí le chéile agus chuí siad timpeall an chathair agus le gabh siad ina daoine ar fad agus ina measc éamach Mahúna agus Crochar Maguire Chomai.
It was such a disaster, not in terms of their cause, not to seize Dublin. Their failure ever to take Dublin was one of the key reasons why the rebellion ultimately failed.
Spray an cogu go gas de Phríd tír ar fad, agus an anion iireachtaí na geannarí géalacha hontaise ina achtas seachtaach díaltais. Go háirithe I bartna de chuige olú a nearnú Jean Flandel orthu. Le linn de Crochar Maguire a bheith névan, hála ár uachasa an seo ag caisleán an tollaigh a Fermanagh. De réir contas go aimseartha, tháinig fórsaí éireannacha bhí cheannas Ruaidhrí Maguire, deara th Chrochar, agus mhair siad breis agus seachtú duine an seo. Fer mrá agus pleistí, ar lá nullig, séideag da hid sa héin.
Fermanagh is one of the bloodiest counties in terms of the atrocities, the mass killings. Fermanagh and Armagh are amongst the bloodiest of all the encounters.
Rud é nar chuidí le cás Crochar Maguire nó le cás í bheith wahanna. Bhí siad beirt I ngéimhin anois I gaslan walla a clia. An caisleán a raibh siad ag éirí ionsaí I dhéanamh. Bhí McMahon granach dúlanach leis na húdarais. I am in your hands, a dúirt sé. Use me as you will. I shall shortly be revenged. Hi rafada go rathraigh sé a fort.
Dúirt Crochar Maguire nach bhís a hadhí a tarlú ní bheith sé an páirteach in éon chomhdhéalaigh a chorabé agus ní dúirt sé foic ach tar éis tamil agus tar éis céasa chur dadmháil sé go raibh sé mar bheall den drám seo a bhí ag éirí Christian Blachlia a gabháil agus iníag an admháil sin churacha héin agus é Mac Mahúna trasna go London go túr London.
A curú bach an tríal, mar ní thuca finithe a thuirteanál as éireann. Áit ar ó cogadh dearg in Iseán, Phríd an tír ar fad. Agus mar mhair ar an donas, bhris cogadh cethar go hasanna amach, cúpla mí in dhé iad London a bhaint amach.
Bhí cogadh cethar arsúl idir an rí ar an Páirte Amháin agus a Parliament ar an taobh eile. Now, bhí an túr agus an chathair London I seileadh agus bhí smacht an Parliament agus it's an Parliament a bhí I bhaim agus is leis na Parliament na prisúnaí seo agus bhí sort show trial le bheith acu.
These guys are the smoking guns in terms of the plot, and you must remember that what was going on in Ireland was part of a much wider story. We've got the 30 Years' War raging across continental Europe. And then in England itself, you have the rise of a very, very strong Protestant Puritan faction led by a man called John Pym, who is really scaremongering. And the greatest way to raise English anxieties about Ireland is to play the Popish card. And the fact that the Irish have risen in rebellion and he's got two of the lead conspirators adds such grist to his propaganda mill. They are evidence, if you want, of this Popish plot that is now going to subvert little Protestant England.
Tour London. Camden a Faragna West Hawkty Assassina. Ishejeg Dahit Tree, Agus Kogu Shekta Karga, Eg Rebu Fried Sassna Agus Erin. Vi Birch Erinach, Gaffa, Isti and Shaw. Eog McMahana, Agus Crocher, Magir.
Vi Corsi Gandonach I Brisún in London. Níor bheith cóide go chorbe mar Catholicií agus mar Éireannig I London ag an am seo. Bhí grán dearag ag muintear London ach go háirithe na Catholicií ar Catholicií Éireann. So bhí am deachar fad ag an beirte go I túir London curach céas go orthú a ríis. Come ar an scéal nach chuir mór an teachtó ar éadí bí agus ein rud eile.
Accounts from Irish priests which were then sent to the continent demonstrate that they were not being fed, they were given very little light, there was only a very small bed in a really rather small cell in which they were kept. McMahon was racked in order to get some more evidence and testimony from him. Maguire, on the other hand, as far as we know, he wasn't racked. He may have been quite forthcoming with some evidence, or may have been persuadable to give evidence which would have pointed the finger at blame as some rather obvious targets for Parliament, and that may have been the Catholic Church. And of course, point some blame towards the King himself, Charles I. There was a certain symbolic value, if you like, to their capture and to their trial. They weren't so much being tried for what they actually did themselves, but the wider course of the rising itself.
Emilunisa Shejig Dahitza Kahar. Hanig Castle Inta the scale na Birche.
It's Leargaro sort of Fuhalav Catalog. Gahar London Sanam Shin agus vi cara egen a vi anan couple sava a smugladas jack goji an tours. Garshi tree in Dorsha. Drapig sheet susk Gian on tour. Frostna and Gian sheets bali on tour. It's Jackson Ishke agus nav sheet goji on Kahar. Agus hui sheet de Volok a Jack a Drury Lane. Jack of one lesh while then four hollow shot. Agus vi got Kasulak on. Groshi nimhe.
Maguire's uncle is Owen Roe O'Neill, that great military commander who was so important in terms of the Continental War. He served with great distinction in Flanders and then went on to become the Commander-in-Chief of the Army in Ulster. I can't imagine that Owen Roe wasn't using those continental connections to help get them out of the Tower.
We should have found our odd squeeze connection on Shoal Goji on Morin August Khan then look Takyakta and Parliament Vigilega the streets is Saxon dealings and Amshin there's little hope to find him again. So we got Kasulakt Gorinna Sheet Elu Glan on tour. Acme Mushin Harla Mar Rinna Kanden Birch Rinna Shet Botun Ofasach.
Der an scéal, tháinig duine acu ban na díl osraí ar an sráide muí agus scartse má haniniug. Daihan éireannach eile ar an tráidiad. Éireannach isce orthú roimhe seo. Owen O'Connell.
Of course, they were recaptured, and then the English weren't having weren't going to take any second chances in terms of the proceedings against them.
Agus Curu McMahon con Bosch, the Mina Sauna, Shejig Diet a Caher. Boas Ufasach Vian, Gerard Litrica Scrive Sagart Kachlekach, con the Morinje, Eganam.
The letters are really rather grisly. They mention how McMahon was cut down before he died, and his entrails cut out of him whilst he was still alive, before he was quartered.
Is mion character McMahon Major Leishneria Ma. Ach tosh bunchive egi le chep an ansihe Cashlan wale clia. Agus o shocker gur uringshe trial ard profile agus boas ufasach dan tras. Ta omra starwil in isher. Bewo arish an chael a veo ar crocher magir.
Of course, Maguire was a peer. He was an Irish lord, and one of his rights as a peer was to be tried in front of his fellow peers. So he asked actually to be tried back in Dublin.
For near Aintig on Brehevlesh, no near Aintig in the Chocties na da tia Parliament lesh agus Farty Shielsen gar Cartas core agus glihul chor ar trial mar tuatoch no commoner is asna.
The writing was very clearly on the wall. There was absolutely no way they were not going to execute him. It was just finding a way of doing it.
Ní cinenne de líthú atá in our era ach cinenne political.
Déirú Magir con Bois ar an tríú lá de bhí fiara séjig daithe sa cuig. Tarinú é go Tyburn le boas ufasach trétra a áil.
Ní rá mór an súbhnas aige chun é héana ólaú mar bhí an siram an sheriff ag choristeachar agus a rá agus a glécar go numpóch sé on a bhréig chuideh. Bhí cróhacht ag Maguire agus dreagar sé go stúma go leor in LMG dúirse ná bíoh chora is achar ligdom súnas ligdom mé héana ólamhú agus má padracha rá.
Execution is a very public act, and in the 17th century, the one thing the state will try to do is get the accused to recant and say, listen, we are very sorry about what we did, we know we did wrong, and beg forgiveness from the state on the scaffold. And Maguire resolutely refuses to do that. And the other thing he remains committed to is his Catholicism. The state refuses him access to clergy and does everything possible to get him to recant, but he doesn't, and he dies believing in his cause, and that is something that the state would be very uncomfortable with, because they see that as the moment about the exercise of power, and he defied them right to the end.
Maguire was also cut down from the gallows at Tyburn while still alive, and with every ounce of his strength he tried to fight off his executioner before he was cut open and his entrails spread across the street.
The Irish Rebellion of 1641 is one of the transformational events in Irish history, full stop. It really is of huge significance at a number of levels. First, more people lost their lives during that decade than at any other moment in Irish history. And that's hugely significant. So the rebellion that this abortive plot triggered unleashed a decade of bloodletting and episodes of ethnic cleansing, mass killing and other atrocities happened. Catholic against Protestant, Protestant against Catholics. It's one of the darkest moments in our history, without a doubt.
Cailach níos mó na fiche cuaig fan géad de déanra na tíre ag an am seo. So I measc na hachtarí seo go léir, tá sais dearma déint ar an beirt seo agus cad a tharla dó. Ach ag an am céine an achtar sin éirí amach sé de dahad a hain, tá sé iontocht tábhachtach. Deire tháinig Cromwell tras na chuir sé ruaig na Catholic beagna go thomláin as an tír ó héobh tír na talún de, so tháinig ahrú bonúsach ó éireann de bhór éirí amach sé de dahad a hain.
And out of that we see the emergence of the Protestant ascendancy of the 18th century. So the rebellion shaped the face of modern Irish history, without a doubt.
Tréimh sé inar cothaíú agus inar buainiú, scoilteanna, seachtacha agus politiúla. Jimar tunnach ar láidir ar stair na heran ina dhéisian go dtí an lá aniu hain. Agus ar nua, bhí a ról hain le himirt ag túr London sa stair sin. Sa héad chlár eile, arcamid ar scéal bhirt phoblachtanach éireannach a bhí gafa an seo sa túr. Tamil sul ar tugu amach chun na dréalach iad agus chun na másaithe. Bhí duine acu ina hagart Cathlicach agus an duine eile ar an ridire dearannach éireannach sa túr in nídéag, séidéag.
The unsettling of a nation is an easy work. The settling is not.
"30 years after the plantation, life in Ulster was still hard. The Irish professed loyalty to King Charles I of England, but many still wanted to recover lands lost to the newcomers. They thought themselves humiliated by those who scorned the Catholic religion and the old Gaelic way of life. These feelings of discontent were to fuel a desire for revenge, and in the autumn of 1641, events came to a head with the outbreak of a great rebellion.
It had been no hard matter to have been a prophet, to have foreseen those black clouds engendering in the Irish air, which broke out afterwards into such fearful tempests of blood.
On the evening of the 22nd of October, Sir Phelim O'Neill, who was a very prominent figure in County Tyrone society, he was a Justice of the Peace. He was an Irishman, but he had integrated very well into the new order. He went to visit his friend at Charlemont, Lord Caulfield. It wasn't unusual because he often had dinner with Lord Caulfield, but on this occasion Sir Phelim arrived with a troop of very badly disciplined and very ill-organised soldiers. The idea, of course, was to take Charlemont, and this was to be the first step in a rising, which was eventually to engulf all of Ulster.
Sir Phelim O'Neill assumed authority in Ulster, and on the 24th of October issued a proclamation at Dungannon.
Every person should make speedy repair unto their own houses, under pain of death. and that no further hurt be done to anyone, under the like pain.
While the proclamation promised no injury to the king's subjects, all over the north the situation was already getting out of control. In South Derry, Moneymore was taken by the rebels, and the towns of Magherafelt and Balaki plundered and burnt to the ground.
All through that period from 1609 to 1641, if you look through the letters and the official dispatches and so on, you get the continuing note of fear among the planters, or at any rate of defensiveness. They were obliged to carry out certain obligations like building fortified farmhouses and so on, which was all part of the defence plan, the defence network.
These mischiefs and miseries cause us to stand continually upon our guard, and when we travel, we take good strength with us. Wherefore, might it please you, when you send those materials I wrote for in my last letter, also to send over some more arms, as muskets, calibers, powder, and bullets. The last calibers bullets you sent were all too big. Wherefore, if you please to send 2 pairs of bullet molds, and lead were best, so they may be made fit for the pieces. Also, some halberds and half-pikes.
The settlers were rightly fearful for their lives and property. At Belturbet, County Cavan, a group of local colonists were seized by the rebels and led out to a nearby bridge. Most were thrown over the parapet to drown in the waters of the River Erne. Others were clubbed to death. It's said that one gentleman was so distracted that he laughed hysterically while being run through with a pike.
Rumours were flying all around the place. Many people simply decided to get even with those who they had had trouble with before. People that they owed money to, debts were simply liquidated by murdering them. People who decided to settle old scores. In many cases, protection rackets were set up, and people went from one person to the other, threatening to protect them, and if they didn't, the worst would happen to them. And in fact, on a number of occasions, we know that people were murdered by gangs because they simply didn't pay their protection money.
The Irish servant, which overnight was undressing his master in duty, the next morning was stripping master and mistress with a too officious tyranny.
What happened was that the rebels would come to a district, they would strip the Protestant of their clothes as well as their possessions. They would tell them that if they didn't leave the area within 7 days, then they would be massacred. So the Protestant community left the areas concerned. They left, in fact, in many cases naked. It was a very severe winter. There was snow on the ground at this time, and many of them did die of hardship, of cold, perhaps to some extent of shock. The Protestant settlers were systematically stripped, clearly with a symbolic intention. In other words, they'd come with nothing, they were to leave with nothing. No one knows for certain how many people died in the course of these atrocities. It was probably about 2,000, although the number of victims soon became inflated to fantastic levels, far beyond the total Protestant population of the time. What is known is that what happened in that bloody autumn of 1641 was to influence events and attitudes in Ireland for generations to come.
Philip Taylor, late of Portadown in the county of Armagh, husbandman sworn, saith that about the 24th of October last, he, this deponent, was taken prisoner at Portadown by Toole McCann, a notorious rebel. At which time the rebels first took the castle, then they assaulted and pillaged the town, and burnt all the houses on the further side of the water. And then the said rebels drowned a great number of English Protestants, of men, women, and children in this deponent's sight, some with their hands tied behind their backs, and saith that the number of them that were then so drowned amounted to 196 persons.
this was a massacre which left a very, very dramatic effect on the Protestant mind at the time. For example, it's the only massacre after which ghosts appear, because some deponents claim that shortly after the massacre, for about a week, a spectral white figure appeared walking across the river crying, "Revenge, revenge." And of course this is one of the functions that ghosts had in 17th century belief, as in Hamlet's father, to cry revenge, revenge for wrongdoings that were done to them. And of course right down to the present day, it's the only event from the 1640s which has actually made it onto an orange banner. So it's clearly made a very important impact on the Protestant mind.
I sometimes think a lot of our psychology really derives from that period, though we don't talk about it very much, and it doesn't figure very largely in the history book. Throughout the whole Protestant population, not just the Presbyterians, I think there developed in Ireland a sense of always having to look over their shoulder, which of course didn't improve matters, relations between the two religious groups in the population.
Almost inevitably, the rumours of massacre and atrocity were to lead to acts of vengeance on Catholics. In January 1642, members of the Magee family were murdered in Island Magee, County Antrim. In the popular imagination, many more Catholics were killed, driven over the Gobbins cliffs to their deaths.
You can interpret this in very widely different ways according to your modern psychology, according to your modern view of what the Irish problem really is. But there's no question about it that it gives rise to a sense of siege, a sense of beleaguerment. And the siege, if there is such a thing as a siege mentality, and if it's a factor in this situation, and it would be hard to deny it, then it really begins in the middle of the 17th century, by my reckoning.
In the summer of 1642, civil war broke out in England between King Charles I and his Parliament. No one living in Ireland could be sure if either King or Parliament would look after their own long-term interests. They also had to contend with several different armies of English, Irish and Scots who were operating throughout the country. In this confusion of shifting allegiances, Irish Catholics found themselves pulled in different directions. James Butler, Earl of Ormond, represented the King's interest and sought peace on terms acceptable to the Old English. Cardinal Rinuccini, the papal nuncio, hoped for outright victory and the return of the lands and liberties of Irish Catholics. Owen Roe O'Neill, with 30 years' experience in the Spanish service, held the best hopes of an Irish military victory. In 1642, leading Catholics from all 4 provinces of Ireland met in Kilkenny to set up a provisional government. It was called the Confederation of Kilkenny. The Confederation gathered the different factions together under the common banner of Catholicism. It drew up the first written constitution of Ireland. It also supported the Royalist cause and adopted the motto, "For God, for the King, for the land of Ireland united." It was a call for unity that was to prove elusive as a confused war dragged on for several years. Owen Roe O'Neill was to win the only Irish victory of note when he defeated Munro's Scottish troops at Benburb, County Tyrone. Owen Roe was the nephew of the great O'Neill. But like his uncle, Owen Roe was unable to press home his advantage. Only one man was to prove strong enough to impose his will totally upon Ireland. That man was an Englishman, Oliver Cromwell.
He had 3 major characteristics. The first of those was that he was a superb general. There's no doubt at all about that. The second one was that he was a religious zealot. And again, there is absolutely no doubt about that. And the third one, which I think is very often forgotten about him, is that he was an English nationalist. And there are very, very few people in British history who have combined all 3 of those. A captain of men, a very, very convinced religious zealot of any description, and an English nationalist of maybe a type that wasn't seen before and possibly has never been seen since.
His first attitude towards the Irish was a strategic one, that the Irish were Catholic and that they were allied with Spain and France. And of course, throughout the 1640s, both Spain and France had supported Ireland during the war. So their Catholicism, allied with their continental powers, was for Cromwell a very considerable problem strategically.
Cromwell arrived in Ireland in August 1649 and straight away marched north to Drogheda. He was filled with a religious fervour and was determined to avenge what he saw as the wholesale slaughter of Irish Protestants at the hands of Catholics in 1641.
You broke the Union. You, unprovoked, put the English to the most unheard of and most barbarous massacre without respect of sex or age that ever the sun beheld, and at a time when Ireland was in perfect peace.
Cromwell himself, in his own religious beliefs, subscribed, of course, to the idea which was very common in the 17th century, that they were living in the last days. And there were all sorts of radical sects grew up around this. And Cromwell himself believed in the Antichrist. And he believed that the Antichrist was on the earth at that time. He identified the Antichrist with the Pope, as many others did at that time. So for him, the war in Ireland was almost a religious war, a war, the battle between Protestant England, representing the truth, and the anti-Christian forces of Catholicism. And he saw this not just in Irish terms, but in European terms as well, because he saw the wars that were going on in Europe as part of the wars of the Antichrist, as predicted in Revelation.
At 5 o'clock in the evening of Tuesday, the 10th of September, soldiers of the new model army stormed the town walls. They were ordered to show no mercy to any who offered armed resistance. Cromwell hoped that opposition elsewhere in Ireland would collapse in the face of a decisive victory. After heavy fighting, the parliamentarians forced a breach in the wall and was soon firmly established in the grounds of St. Mary's Church. The fighting moved to the Mill Mount, where that night 2,000 men were put to the sword. The survivors were now in full retreat across the River Boyne to the other part of the town. When 100 men refused to surrender, Cromwell ordered the steeple of St. Peter's Church to be burned. One man was heard to cry in the midst of the flames, "God damn me, God confound me, I burn, I burn." There was no doubt in the mind of Oliver Cromwell as to the righteousness of his actions.
This was a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, who have imbued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent effusion of blood for the future, which are the satisfactory grounds for such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret.
In Drogheda, I suppose you would have to say, he observed the rules of war as they were understood in the 17th century. In other words, he called upon the garrison to surrender. The garrison refused to surrender. He sacked the town. He in effect slaughtered the garrison. Then he went rather beyond, I suppose, the rules of war, because some of the slaughter was of civilians. But I think you have to say that by 17th century standard, particularly European standard, what he did was pretty commonplace. That if you didn't in fact obey a call to surrender, if you tried to hold out, then you took the consequences.
There are so many atrocities in Irish history, committed by all sides, by the English, by the Irish, by various elements of the Irish population against one another, that it seems a bit odd in a way to pick out an incident like the Siege of Drogheda and say, well, this is something really beyond normal limits of warfare in the 17th century. It wasn't, of course. In the 17th century, we had the religious wars in Germany and Central Europe, the 30 Years' War, where the most appalling atrocities were taking place. At the same time, it seems to be connected in some way. But Cromwell's utter heartlessness in that incident, at that particular stage, and the fact that that's documented and recorded, has left an indelible mark on the Irish psyche.
Cromwell turned south and sacked Wexford. Other towns in Munster were forced to submit voluntarily, and the Catholic Confederation disintegrated. A policy of banishment was initiated to finally crush any further resistance. It was decreed that all transportable persons move west of the River Shannon. The Irish rebels had to face the stark choice of moving to Hell or Connaught.
When the campaign had finished, Cromwell rewarded his soldiers as soldiers had been rewarded before by granting them land in Ireland, by taking it from the Irish, by telling the Irish that they could go to Hell or to Connaught, and the land that they left was given to the Cromwellian soldiers. It was in settlement of pay. It was also in settlement of, if you like, it was a form of redundancy money, because warfare was now over, Parliament controlled the country, and there was no need for an army as large as had been maintained by Parliament, so soldiers simply had to be got rid of, and this was one way of keeping them quiet, by giving them land in Ireland.
Cromwell's infamous campaign in Ireland certainly created the same kind of reaction among Catholics in Ireland as 1641 had created among Protestants in the north. Of course, in picking these things out, the way Protestants pick out things from Irish history, the way Catholics pick out things from Irish history, we are being desperately selective. We're not, in fact, talking about history at all. There are two histories of Ireland. There is the history which is written in the books, and there's the history which influences the way we behave towards each other.
Well, history is something that has great meaning for large numbers of people who look at their past, and the nature of history is always changing. You know, the late Professor Williams used to say about history that it was never either black nor white, but infinite shades of grey. And by that we mean that people are always coming in and changing their version and their view of the past as they get more experience, more understanding, or inject more meaning into some incident or some forgotten memory that they have revived of the past.
A lady living in Loughgall, and with her children 5, she begged for the sake of them to let her be alive, that she might go to England, her husband there to see, and to live in peace and unity, and far from popery.
Historians began to look at the myth of 1641, and particularly American historians who are very much into the myth element of history, and again began to delve into the Inquisition papers and the deposition papers, and to see, did it make sense that such a powerful myth, which disturbed the Ulster settlers at the beginning of the events of the 1640s, which coincided with the Civil War in England, did that account for the kind of irrational fear which invades the settler community, later the Unionist community in Northern Ireland, and which makes them fear the Catholics with such intensity and such irrationality, and perhaps with such conviction that they will never make common community with them.
At least 1,000 faithful souls in Portadown were slain. All were the deeds of popery, their wicked hordes to gain. But God sent down brave Cromwell, our deliverer to be, and he put down popery in this land, us Protestants set free.
I saw Pearsley quoted it recently in a lecture he gave, well, at least some years ago, in a lecture he gave to the Bobby Jones University. He talked about the massacre of Protestants and the drowning of people in the River Bann, and so many people were drowned, apparently according to this legend, that the rebels were able to walk across dry shod from one side of the River Bann to the other. My daughter, who's a journalist, was down in Lurgan or Portadown some months ago, and she was assured by either an Orange man or a member of the DUP that what happened in 1641 really did happen, because he said there's a photograph over there in the Orange Hall to prove it. The propaganda at that time said that something like 300,000 people were killed or driven from their homes or suffered in some other way. Now this was very quickly translated into 300,000 murdered, and it was translated further into 300,000 murdered in the first week of the rebellion.
(1641) was a period of bitter conflict in England between Charles I and Parliament, and of deep tensions between Protestants and Roman Catholics. In the circumstances, it wasn't always easy for people to separate truth from fiction and propaganda, particularly where Ireland was concerned. Literature like this stirred up a lot of anger in Britain. People were led to believe that Catholic rebels had massacred 300,000 Scots and English Protestants in 1641.
It's in the intermediate range of the figures which were believed at the time. In fact, it's the 1646 figure. 4 years earlier, the figure that was commonly accepted was one of 154,000. 6 years later, it was 600,000. But in talking about the rebellion, I think that it's really not very useful to try to establish exact numbers. The major controversial issue, in fact, historically, has been whether a rebellion took place at all.